Picture the Arctic in the dead of winter. Wind that cuts through fur, nights that last for months, temperatures that drop past -40 degrees, cold enough to freeze skin in minutes. Now picture surviving that, with one lamp. Most people hear that and picture a small candle, barely enough to see by, let alone stay alive. That is the common assumption. No wood, no coal, no way to make real heat. So surely people froze anyway, or kept a fire burning we no longer understand. They did not. One stone lamp, no bigger than a modern sink, pushed the temperature inside an ice house up by 60 degrees. Warm enough inside to sleep in a t-shirt. It is measurable physics, studied by archaeologists and engineers, the same math behind modern insulation. Here is what nobody tells you. That lamp was not just for heat. It cooked food, dried boots, melted drinking water, and lit the dark for months at a time. One flame, 5 jobs, and a house built from the enemy itself. That lamp is called a qulliq. It is carved from soapstone, a soft gray rock, into a shape like a crescent moon. It is small enough for one person to carry, and shallow enough to fit inside 2 cupped hands stretched wide. These lamps were not tiny either. Some stretched close to 2 feet across, carved wide enough to hold a wick running nearly the length of a forearm. And the biggest ones, built by later generations, grew larger still. The bigger the wick line, the more heat and light it threw across a room. Soapstone itself helps here too. It heats up slowly and holds that heat, cooling down gradually rather than dropping cold the instant the flame dims, acting almost like a small stone radiator sitting in the middle of the room. Soapstone was also soft enough to carve with simple tools, stone, bone, or hammered copper, letting a single carver shape a thin, precise basin by hand without the rock cracking under the blade. Inside it burns rendered seal fat. Not wood, not coal. Fat from a ringed seal, melted down and soaked into a long wick made from dried grass and moss. That wick sits along the flat front edge of the lamp, and when it is lit, it burns in a low, steady line of flame, more like a stove burner than a candle. A single lamp like this puts out somewhere between 100 and 200 watts of heat. That is roughly the same output as 2 old light bulbs, or a small space heater running on its lowest setting. Not much on its own against an outside world at 40 degrees below zero. But the lamp is never alone. Every person sleeping inside the shelter gives off another 80 to 100 watts, just from being alive and breathing. Put a lamp and 2 or 3 people inside a small, sealed dome of snow, and the numbers start to add up fast. Near the ceiling, where the warmest air collects, temperatures climb to somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees above freezing. That is warm enough to sleep without a heavy coat on, while outside the wind is trying to freeze exposed skin in minutes. That gap, from -40 outside to +20 inside, is a swing of roughly 60 degrees. 60 degrees of temperature difference, created and held by one small stone lamp, a handful of people, and a house built out of packed snow. This is not folklore. Researchers have measured it directly, checking the numbers with the same heat equations engineers use to design modern buildings. The math holds up, and that number alone should be enough to change how you picture a shelter made of snow. But the strangest part is not the heat. It is the material holding that heat in. Here is the part that surprises almost everyone. The very thing that should be the enemy, the snow itself, is what makes this whole system work. Snow is not solid ice. Packed by wind into a dome, it is mostly empty space. About 95% of a block of wind-packed snow is trapped air, sitting between tiny ice crystals that have fused together at points of contact. without fully melting into a solid block. That trapped air barely moves heat at all. Still air is already one of the best insulators there is, and packed snow is almost entirely made of it. Compared to solid ice, which lets heat pass through easily, wind-packed snow blocks that same heat far more effectively, wall for wall. A thick wall of snow can hold in warmth about as well as some modern insulated walls, using nothing but frozen crystals and trapped air. This was not guesswork. It came from thousands of years of trial and error, going back long before this exact design existed, with each generation of builders refining exactly which snow held heat and which snow let it through, long before anyone wrote the physics down on paper. That alone would be impressive. But the snow does something else, something almost too clean to be an accident. As the lamp heats the air near the ceiling above freezing, the very inner surface of the snow blocks begins to melt, just slightly, just at the surface. Not enough to drip, not enough to soak anyone below. The surrounding snow, just a few inches further out, is still locked at far below zero, so that thin film of meltwater does not run anywhere. It gets pulled straight back into the porous snow around it, and refreezes there as a thin sheet of solid ice. Now the inside surface of the shelter is coated in a smooth, sealed layer of ice, a fraction of an inch thick, sitting on top of the looser packed snow underneath. That thin ice layer does two jobs at once. First, it seals every tiny gap between the packed snow blocks, stopping outside wind from leaking in and warm air from leaking out. Second, it blocks water vapor, the moisture from breathing and cooking, from soaking back into the snow and ruining its insulating air pockets. In other words, the shelter seals itself. The same heat that would seem to threaten a house made of snow is the thing that waterproofs it, using nothing but its own leftover warmth. Nobody carries in tar or resin or any sealant at all. The building finishes itself from the inside as it is being lived in. That is the twist most people never hear. A house of frozen water, kept warm by fire, uses that same fire to seal its own walls against the cold. It sounds like it should not work, and yet the harder that lamp burns, the tighter that shelter becomes. Once the shell is sealed, everything happening inside gets far easier to control. And it turns out, the shelter itself is built with a second trick, one that has nothing to do with heat at all. A lamp that needs constant refilling by hand would be exhausting to run for months at a time. This one mostly refills itself. Before any of this could work, the wick itself had to be built the right way, not just left as loose grass. Dried cotton grass and moss were packed and pressed by hand into a firm, even ridge along the front rim, then soaked through with oil so it caught flame easily once lit. Pack that ridge too loose, and the flame burned wild and smoky. Pack it too tight, and it barely caught at all. Getting that right took practice, long before the flame ever touched it. Solid chunks of seal fat are placed just behind the wick, propped along a gentle slope at the back of the lamp's basin. As the flame burns, its heat radiates backward onto that solid fat. Slowly, the fat begins to melt. Once melted, the liquid fat runs down that slope, pulled by nothing but gravity, into the shallow pool where the flame is burning. The harder the flame burns, the more heat it throws backward, the faster the fat melts, and the more liquid fuel flows down to feed it. If the flame burns low, less fat melts, and less fuel arrives. It is a loop that balances itself without anyone touching it. Burn hot, and more fuel arrives to match it. Burn low, and the fuel supply slows down to match that too. The lamp does not run dry as quickly as a simple candle would, and it does not flood itself with too much liquid fat either. The wick pulls that fuel upward the same way a candle wick does, through tiny gaps between its fibers, a process called capillary action, drawing liquid fat steadily up to the flame at the surface. None of this needed to be understood the way a modern engineer understands it, with equations and diagrams. It only needed to work, tested and adjusted across countless winters, until the shape of the basin, the slope of the fuel, and the packing of the wick fell into a design that fed itself. That is the quiet trick sitting inside every one of these lamps. Not just fire, but a small feedback loop, gravity and heat working together so the flame regulates its own fuel supply for hours at a time. But keeping that flame burning clean, without smoke, without it going out, still took a human hand. And that job belonged to someone very specific, something worth coming back to. Step back from the lamp for a moment and look at the shape of the house itself. A dome of snow blocks, cut and stacked into a curve with nothing underneath holding it up. No wooden beams, no support poles, no frame of any kind. The blocks are not stacked straight up in rings the way a brick wall is built. They are cut and leaned inward in one continuous spiral, curving up and over toward a single point at the top. That curve is close to a shape engineers call a catenoid, the same family of curve you see in old stone arches and modern domed roofs. The reason that shape matters is simple physics. In a curve like this, the weight of every block is carried as pure compression, pushed straight down and inward through the blocks below it, rather than pulling sideways or hanging in tension. Stone and packed snow are both strong under compression and weak under tension, so a shape that only ever squeezes them and never pulls or bends them is exactly the shape that lets them hold enormous weight without cracking. Building one this way took real skill and no tools beyond a long snow knife and a practiced eye. Blocks were cut straight from the snow around the site, tested by hand for the right density, then set one after another in that inward-leaning spiral, each one leaning just slightly more than the last, until the whole structure curved in on itself and closed at the top in a matter of hours. Get the angle wrong early, and the whole dome could lean, sag, or collapse before it was ever finished. The very last block placed at the top, sometimes called the king block, locks the whole spiral together. Once it is set, the entire dome supports its own weight, and the weight of any snow falling on top of it, using nothing but the geometry of the curve. There are no internal walls holding the roof up, and no wasted space taken up by support beams. The entire inside is open, floor to ceiling, shaped only by the outer shell itself. This is the same basic principle behind stone cathedrals built centuries later, and the geodesic domes engineers still design today. Different material, same underlying idea. Shape a curve correctly, and it can hold enormous weight without a single support underneath it. And once that shell stands on its own, the air moving inside it still has to be managed just as carefully as the shape holding it up. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. That single fact, true everywhere on Earth, is used inside this shelter as deliberately as any modern building's ventilation system, and it costs nothing but the way the floor is cut. The entrance to the shelter is not a door at ground level. It is a tunnel, dug down below the level of the main floor, then curving back up into the living space. Anyone entering has to duck down into that low tunnel first, then climb back up into the room. That low tunnel is not there to make crawling harder for no reason. Cold outside air, heavier and denser than warm air, sinks the moment it enters. Instead of flowing straight into the living space, it drops into that low tunnel and pools there, like water settling into a ditch. It has to be forced upward against its own weight to reach the floor where people are sitting, and it rarely gets that push. Above that sunken tunnel, the main floor sits on a slightly raised bench, and the highest point of all, a raised sleeping platform at the back, sits higher still. Heat rises, so the warmest air in the entire structure collects exactly where people sleep, while the coldest air stays trapped down in the entrance far below. No door was needed to block that cold air out. No curtain, no barrier, no material seal at all. The shape of the floor itself does the job, using nothing but the basic fact that cold air is heavier than warm air. That same idea shows up in a small hole cut at the very top of the dome, letting warm, damp air escape upward and out, while fresh air is pulled in low through that same sunken tunnel. Get that balance wrong, and the risk was not just discomfort. Too little fresh air moving through, and carbon dioxide and moisture built up in that sealed space, leaving people groggy or worse. Too much air escaping through that same vent, and the heat carefully built up all day leaked straight out through the roof. So that single hole was watched and adjusted by hand, plugged a little tighter with snow or fur, or opened a little wider, the same way a modern home's vents are tuned today, just without a thermostat doing the work. None of it runs on machinery. It runs on the weight of air itself, arranged by the shape of the floor and a single vent at the roof. And once heat, air, and structure are all working together, that one small lamp still had one more job left to do. In fact, it had 4 more. Step back and count everything that single lamp was actually doing all at once, every single day. First, heat, the job already covered. Second, light. For months at a time, during the darkest stretch of the Arctic winter, the sun does not rise at all. That same steady flame was the only source of light inside the shelter, day and night, for the entire season. Third, drinking water. There is no liquid water lying around in this environment for most of the year, and eating snow directly to quench thirst actually cools the body down further, pushing it closer to hypothermia rather than away from it. So a stone pot was hung directly above the flame, packed with snow or chunks of ice. As heat rose off the lamp, that snow slowly melted into water people could safely drink. Fourth, cooking. That same pot, or one placed beside it, was used to cook meat and boil broth, turning raw seal, whale, or caribou into food that could actually be digested and used for energy in the cold. Fifth, drying clothes. Wet clothing in this climate is genuinely dangerous, far more dangerous than it sounds. Damp fur loses much of its insulating power, and wet skin loses heat far faster than dry skin does. Every evening, wet boots and coats were hung on a rack, positioned directly in the rising warm air above the lamp, and the gentle heat dried them out overnight. So nobody had to step back out into the cold the next morning in gear that was still soaked through. One lamp, one flame, 5 separate jobs that, in almost any other climate, would need 5 separate tools or appliances to do. None of that happened automatically, though. The flame still had to be watched almost constantly by someone who knew exactly how to read it. Too much liquid fat pooling around the wick, and the flame choked, throwing off smoke and soot, and eventually carbon monoxide, in a sealed space where that gas had nowhere safe to go. Too little fuel reaching the wick, and the flame simply died out, leaving the shelter to cool fast. That job, tending the lamp, fell almost entirely to women, using a small tool carved from bone or antler to pat the wick down, scrape away ash, and keep the flame burning in a thin, clean, nearly smokeless line. It was not a small responsibility. A lamp kept badly could mean a smoke-filled shelter, or a family waking up to a cold house in weather that kills in minutes. A lamp kept well meant warmth, light, food, water, and dry clothes, all from one small flame, for as long as it was fed and watched. That same lamp never fully disappeared, even after modern heaters arrived. Today, a lit qulliq is still used to open major ceremonies and gatherings across the Arctic, carried in and lit by an elder as a mark of respect for exactly this kind of knowledge. It appears on the official coat of arms of Nunavut, a territory in northern Canada, sitting right alongside a stone marker traditionally used for wayfinding. A tool built purely to survive the cold has become a symbol of identity and resilience that has outlasted the need for it. Other people, in other brutal climates, arrived at strikingly similar answers on their own. High in the mountains, herders burned melted animal fat in stone and metal lamps to heat homes with almost no wood at all. On the far southern tip of South America, in constant cold wind and rain, other groups burned seal fat over turf hearths, built low on purpose so that cold air pooled away from where people slept. Different lamps, different shelters, different corners of the planet, arriving at the same basic idea completely on their own. That is the real story here. Not a small candle barely holding back the cold, but a fully engineered system, one flame doing 5 jobs, inside a house that seals and insulates itself as it warms. A house built from the enemy, powered by a single lamp, and kept alive by a single steady hand. That is what actually sat between people and 40 degrees below zero for months at a time, for thousands of years now, using nothing but stone, fat, and snow.